We're thrilled to welcome Mosi Ifatunji here to speak with us today. I will not take any more time except to say welcome and thank you for joining us.
All right.
Welcome.
Speaking of, anyway, all right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mosi Ifatunji. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin at Madison in the Departments of Afro-American Studies and Sociology. And I'm here to give you a talk on racial orders and multivariate statistics, the case of the white supremacist regression model. Now, I know that seems like a bit of a crazy claim that a regression model can be sort of in league with white supremacy. But I hope to be able to defend the claim by the end of the talk today, and maybe you can tell me if you buy it or not. Also, sorry, a little bit of confusion here this morning. I also just want to thank Michelle and Allison for the invitation to come and talk to you folks. This is my first time in this part of the world, so that's always a treasure. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is start up with my argument for the day. Next slide. So my first argument, the first part of my argument is that all the founding fathers of modern day social statistics got interested in using statistics to study people. They were motivated by an interest in race, and they were all white supremacists. They were all eugenicists. So given that all of the founding fathers of statistics were white supremacists, the assumptions and practices they developed were likely developed to confirm and legitimate white supremacy. Therefore, we may need to revise best practices, especially when our studies are motivated by an expressed interest in race and social stratification. So third, I'm gonna also sketch a preliminary draft of a framework, one that some professional and social scientists might find useful in guiding their use of statistics to study race and stratification. Although those who initially are interested in statistics were very interested in race, that is to say the founding fathers of social statistics to study people, they were all very interested in race. Most social scientists today study these topics separately. They study race separately than they study statistics. So as a result, best practices in statistics are often not informed by how race actually works, and students of race and ethnicity are often uninterested in statistics. The perspective that I offer here today, that of racial orders, attempts to rejoin these scientific communities. I'll provide some practical and maybe even some not so practical suggestions for best practices, certainly for those interested in studying race and stratification. Fair warning though, I'm not going to be proposing any new math per se, but offering what I hope will be a compelling rationale for using existing statistical methodologies in creative ways that depart from the white supremacist roots of statistics. In short, we need to think about how and why we include race coefficients in our statistical models, and how the inclusion of dummy variables for race might lead to model misspecification. And last one here, oops, sorry, assess, where am I? Okay, right, so my overall goal is to convince you that the reflexive habit of including race coefficients in our models results in model misspecification and a less than clear view of exactly how race matters in society. All right, so a few quick notes here on qualifications and definitions. Next slide. So the first thing I want to note is that this talk here today, I'm not going to get into how to correctly, so-called quote unquote, correctly identify people's racial group membership. We can talk about that more in the workshop. I do have an ontology that I've been developing for the study of race and ethnicity in the social sciences, that of ethno-raciality, and we'll talk about that in the workshop. But for the purpose of the talk today, I'm not going to get into like how do you correctly identify people's group membership, etc. And then also a quick note on math and science. So math is the language of scientists, right? So it is not necessarily a science in and of itself. That is, scientists use math as a means of communicating with one another. Math is not the truth. Math is a way of communicating perspectives and logics held and developed by human beings. When scientists use math, we create the symbols, the definitions, we provide the assumptions, we determine the appropriate steps, and provide the logic and rules for derivations. We tell math what to say and how to say it. In this way, math is human and therefore flawed, just like the rest of us. So the reason why I'm saying this is just that there's this way in which we learn statistics where we just sort of take the formulas that are given to us as if they sort of arrived by divine intervention and they can't be troubled, right? And so I just kind of want to put that perspective aside, and which will allow us to be a little bit more creative in how we think about using math to study people. Since, white supremacy, I guess the other sort of working acknowledgement here is that I am definitely an Americanist. So a lot of this will have America as a kind of foil, as a kind of backdrop. And so I'm happy to have people interject and correct me if I'm entirely missing the boat given the current context. Definitely interested in learning more about how sort of race, ethnicity, et cetera, work in Canada. But in the United States, white supremacy is a key construct. And so and it's a key construct for this talk. And so before we kind of get into the business of the talk, let's define white supremacy. So there's a lot of different definitions for white supremacy. So let me provide one that I have in mind as I work to advance my argument for today. Although there are many definitions of white supremacy, Frances Ainsley, a faculty member, at least she used to be at University of Tennessee at Knoxville School of Law, provides a working definition. Next slide, please. So by white supremacy, she states, I do not mean to allude only to the self-conscious racism of white supremacist hate groups. I infer instead to the political, economic, and cultural system in which whites overwhelmingly control power and material resources, conscious and unconscious ideas of white supremacy, and entitlement, conscious and unconscious ideas of white supremacy and entitlement are widespread, and relations of white dominance and non-white subordination are daily reenacted across a broad array of institutions and social settings. That is to say, I'm going with a structural definition of white supremacy as opposed to a kind of more of a individual level kind of prejudice view of white supremacy. All right, so we're continuing on here with my definition for white supremacy. All right, so the primary difference between this definition and the one that many of us have in our heads when we hear this term is that this definition that I just gave is not rooted in the psychopathology of unrelated individuals. That is, from this perspective, white supremacy is not irrational, but rational and functional. Next slide. According to Ainsley, next slide, I mean, next thing. According to Ainsley, the ideas, attitudes, opinions, and rationales that flow from white supremacy may sound bigoted or wrong-headed when taken out of historical context, but they often seem normal, commonsensical, and legitimate when evaluated within the context of their birth. Indeed, the ideas found in white supremacy undergird the design and function of Western governance. They are not irrational or unproductive. They are associated with a long history of systematic domination. In any case, my point is that when I use the term white supremacy, I am referring to its social structural form. One aspect of this is ideological. So that is, in any given period of white supremacy, there is a pre-existing set of readily available explanations for cross-sectional racial inequality. which make the existence and multi-generational racial stratification seem unproblematic. Since most of the people that take up these explanations reflexively, the roots of white supremacy are not in the minds of any given individual, but they are in the larger social structural discourse. Or to use the phraseology of today, the roots of white supremacy are in the cloud. So what am I saying here? Certainly in the West, we operate in a social ether where white supremacy serves as the foundation, and therefore we are all at risk. We are all at risk for taking up views that are in line with white supremacy. This does not make us evil, nor does it make us progenitors, nor does it make the progenitors of social statistics evil. This taking up things that we're raised around is just what makes us human. The fact that we all take up popular ideas, especially ones that make us cool, is what makes us human, not what makes a specific set of humans uniquely evil. Nonetheless, I do contend that the founders of social statistics were, quote unquote, true believers in the basic precepts of white supremacy. And as a result, the ideology of white supremacy informed the basic contours of early statistical methodology. That is, certainly early on, social statistics was an appendage of white supremacy, developed to further the interests and provide additional rationale for the existence of human races and legitimation for the overrepresentation or prevalence of whites at the top or center of our social, political, and economic order in Western settler and colonial societies. All right, so what is the connection between white supremacy and social statistics? I think this is a good moment for me to sort of say as an aside, for folks who may not know, I taught at ICPSR for 3 summers, which is basically a stats camp at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, which is where I was found out by Michelle. And so in any case, this is a collection of faculty who are not only highly skilled in statistics, but also consider themselves to be very good teachers. And so, shout out to ICPSR. I love ICPSR. I think it's a great institution. However, many of my colleagues were completely unaware that basically all of the founding fathers of social statistics were eugenicists. And in fact, I actually had gotten some arguments with people. They just did not know this history, and they thought that I was being a little bit overzealous, and so I had to pull up the history for them, right? And so I'm saying this to say that, again, even though the use of social statistics to study people, the use of numbers, the use of math to study people was largely motivated by eugenicists who had an interest in race, we no longer study these topics together. And so I'm just going to lay out a brief sort of history of these connections between white supremacy and statistics. So history is important. A historical analysis allows us to observe the social, political, and ideological context within which early statistical assumptions and practices emerged. As it turns out, the historical context or initial set of motivations for the development of statistics was to prove the existence of racial speciation among Homo sapiens, and to discover the reasons why some Homo sapiens, namely whites, were superior to others. So who are these mysterious founding fathers? So all of the founding fathers of social statistics were eugenicists. The primary motivation for using statistics to study people was the eugenics movement of the 19th and 20th century. The central figures that wrote all the foundational theories for social statistics were all keenly motivated by interest in advancing white supremacy. So these are 4 different books that folks use. So many of you might be aware of The Measure of Man, written by Stephen Jay Gould, who's an anthropologist. And then, so that's basically a review of all the different kind of craniometric kind of early practices of anthropologists, etc. The Big Test is a book of sort of about education in the United States and talks about the development of tests. And the tests that we end up using were all kind of motivated by securing whites' positions in colleges. A great title, Even the Rat Was White, is a book that psychologists use to talk about white supremacy in the early development of psychology and their use of statistics there. And then the canonical Thicker Than Blood by Tukufu Zuberi. Yes, ma'am.
So for the big test, do you mean like standardized testing?
That's
like
right.
SATs?
Yep. So all that stuff was developed at Princeton, and it's basically a review of how that test was developed and whose interests were being sought after. What people don't fully recognize is that the whole idea of IQ as a construct was developed as part of the eugenicist project to determine differences between racial groups. There was no interest in IQ until there was an interest in trying to record, come up with evidence as to why the racial groups were different. And so therefore the test was designed to do that on purpose. In any case, yes. Thicker Than Blood by Tukufu Zuberi is canonical. Any person, I would say, in the social sciences, especially economics, sociology, political science, people who are using big N, blah, blah, blahs. I think, before you open up Stata or R, I think you should definitely read Thicker Than Blood. It's just a great review of the history, and a lot of what I'm going to say next really comes from Tukufu's work. All right, so who are the founding fathers? So we'll start with the first one, so click once. So a key dimension in the emergence of social statistics was the use of social statistics, and the key figure in the rise of statistics was Francis Galton. Galton is the progenitor of the modern statistical revolution in the social sciences. Galton's books and other scholarly articles all use statistics to assert that genius, or IQ, and success are racially inherited, and that this process could be measured statistically. The great names in the foundation of statistics were advocates of eugenics. These include, next person, Francis Edgeworth, who developed a test to ascertain whether different subpopulations existed within the bell curve. Edgeworth used Galton's formulation of correlation as a vehicle to employ classical statistical theory in understanding social difference. Next person, building on Edgeworth, Carl Pearson published a series of papers between 1894 and 1916 titled Mathematical Contributions to the Theory of Evolution. Pearson's elaboration of Edgeworth's theorem advanced correlation theory into mainstream social statistics. Specifically, Pearson provided a basic formula for estimating the correlation coefficient and a test of its accuracy. So this is important because the regression correlation coefficient, which is the bedrock of multivariate statistics, was developed by Pearson, and that first correlation coefficient, the Pearson correlation coefficient, was developed on a study of IQ differences between Blacks and whites. In 1897, George Yule provided the conceptual and statistical expression that completed Galton's project to apply statistics to the study of society. Yule was one of the first social statisticians to demonstrate the relationship between regression and least squared estimates. Yule extended the application of regression by performing one of the first regression analysis of poverty. Social statistics took another intellectual leap when Ronald Fisher, a founder of the Cambridge Eugenics Society, published statistical methods for research workers in 1925, and the Design of Experiments in 1935. These books had tremendous impact on the teaching and practice of statistics. Fisher's work clarified the distinction between a sample statistic and population value, a major tenet of modern statistics, right? How do you draw inference from a sample to a larger population? In addition to these statistical contributions, Fisher was an ardent advocate of eugenics, which is best seen in his book, The General Theory of Natural Selection. So I actually got in a fisticuffs, a bit of a verbal fisticuffs with one of my beloved colleagues at ICPSR, who's now retired. He used to run ICPSR for a long time, and his response to me when I told him that Fisher was a eugenicist was like, no, he's an agriculturalist. He was like into agriculture. I was like, okay, let me show you. And so all these people were sort of card-carrying members of their local eugenic society organizations, their chapters. Also, a side note, I've recently begun a large-scale effort with the Population Association of America, which is the place where demographers sort of collect themselves. And we're trying to recruit non-white folks to become demographers. So we have a bunch of undergraduates who spend a little bit of their summer with us, and we try to get them built into the queue. But it's a tough sell because the major figures of different eugenic societies, they are the people who came together and constituted the first board of the Population Association of America. Now, I am a PAA member, right? So I'm not, wholly discounting PAA, but the basic premise of demography is first, how do you identify stable populations? That is, just because those populations may or may not correspond to our wider view of racial categories or whatever, the idea that there are populations is a racial idea, right? And so the entire PAA is also born out of the same kind of spirit, if you will. So white supremacy matters, right? So why is this an important point? And there are two reasons why it's important for my talk here today. Given the objectives of the first social statisticians, it stands to reason that the first assumptions and guidelines for statistical practice were conceptualized with an ideological intent, whereby assumptions that might have undermined the notion that races exist or that whites constituted the norm, center, or best race were cast aside in favor of assumptions and rules that at a minimum left white supremacy and the notion of human races intact. It is only in a social, political, and economic vacuum that the selection of assumptions is actually arbitrary or unbiased. The second major reason why it is important to place the formation of social statistics in the historical context of white supremacy is that it makes rethinking the basic assumptions and practices of social scientists less heretical. Some of my colleagues, many of them still at Ann Arbor, have drawn opposition to some of my suggestions for revised assumptions and standard practices because in their view, I am violating the laws of social statistics. Given my perspective on the intent and function of these laws, I do not lose much sleep when I violate them. Now, just as a bit of a turn, I'm going to move towards a theory of racial orders and a conceptualization of race in society. So how do we think about race is always going to be important when we begin to start using statistical models. One of my biggest concerns when it comes to people, right? So if you're going to become a proficient statistician, person who uses math to study people, you'll become aware there's an extended sequence of courses that you're going to need to take, right? Which requires a lot of time and effort. And it means, and it's also true, it's also simultaneously true that if you're going to be a good, sort of race theorist or a person who studies race stratification, you're going to need to take more than one graduate level seminar on the topic, right? Myself, I'm sort of an outlier. In grad school, I took 8 graduate seminars on various topics having to do with race and ethnicity. 3 of them were methodological and 5 of them were substantive. So I'm saying all this to say that what ends up happening is people who want to do the math well, and they have an honest, so to speak, good faith interest in using math to study people, they end up spending all their time thinking through the math, and then they present models that don't fully appreciate, don't have a nuanced or highly developed understanding of what we might call race or ethnicity, what I generally prefer to call ethno-raciality, but that's a topic we'll cover in the workshop and maybe for another day. All right, so let's first, as we think about racial orders, we'll first start talking about what is race. Some would argue that race is an observable, individual level characteristic. The notion here is that race is located somewhere in the body of individuals, and therefore, as social scientists, we only need to develop best practices for accurately observing whatever feature of the human body that contains this necessarily identifying information. Studies that rely on this conceptualization draw on observations of skin color, hair texture, or bone structure, and they also measure genetic ancestry. So others have proposed that race is determined by the perception or feelings of an individual, and therefore physiognomy, or the way in which we look, is less important. That is, a person's true race cannot be determined by making observational inferences from the subject's multivariate distribution of racialized physical features. Instead, it can only be determined through self-reports of any given individual. This would include responses to measurement scales intended to assess like racial identity and such. Next point. Yeah, let's see. There she is. So proponents of both of those views conceptualize race as an individual level construct. However, scholars have provided group-based definitions for race. These scholars locate the basic materials of race in the relationship between racialized human population groups. That is, for these thinkers, the body does not hold or contain race. Race exists at the level of intergroup relations and is best observed in various forms of boundary work, quote unquote, which might turn on a broad range of markers of membership. So Omi and Winan provide one of the better conceptualizations of this view in their highly influential text, Racial Formation. They state, the effort must be made to understand race as an unstable, decentered complex of social meanings. The effort must be made to understand race as an unstable, decentered complex of social meanings, consistently being transformed by political struggle. With this in mind, let us propose a definition for race. Race is a concept which signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. Although the concept of race invokes biologically based human characteristics, so-called phenotypes, and by the way, folks, I generally am not, I do not think we should be using this phrase. A lot of people use this racial phenotypes phrase, only because to my chagrin, I figured out that a phenotype is by definition a genetic term, right? So phenotypes are expressions of genotypes. So when you, so you could have a phenotype, for example, some of my colleagues in social genetics, have phenotypes for depression, phenotypes for obesity, et cetera, and so forth. So when we say racial phenotype, we are conceding that there's a genotypic contribution to race. So we should generally use other terms like racialized physical features, if that's what we're talking about. Selection of these particular human features for the purposes of racial signification is always and necessarily a social and historical process. There is no biological basis for distinguishing human groups along the lines of race. Indeed, the categories employed to differentiate human groups along racial lines reveal themselves upon serious examination to be at best imprecise and at worst completely arbitrary. According to this view, identification, either observed or self-reported at the individual level, does not negate, shape, or influence larger social forces that determine the relationship between racialized human population groups. Said another way, for these scholars, the unit of analysis is not the individual, but the group, which becomes important for when I make some recommendations later on. That is, it is important. It is an important point because classical models of statistical regression are designed to study the properties of individuals that are unrelated to one another. Okay, so if you're assessing group differences, you're assuming that the people within a given group are related to each other in some way. You know, and related might be a loaded term. Of course, here I'm not talking about family relations or anything like that. All right. So we've talked a little bit about race. Now let's talk a little bit about racial orders. Now the first and in some ways the most important assumption of my racial orders framework is that race is a latent property of society. This latency can be traced to various documents that constitute Western governments. So here I'm thinking particularly of a book written by Charles Mills, who's a friend and colleague, and he recently died, recently transitioned. But his 1997 book, The Racial Contract, is, you know, very insightful on this. So the deeply conceptual nature of this argument goes beyond the scope of my talk today, but it will suffice to say that I'm working on a manuscript that develops this idea more formally, this idea of racial orders. The implication of this for this talk today is that as opposed to focusing on how to most accurately measure race, the race of any given individual, and instead of working to ensure that all known forms of racial group membership are represented in a given model, the racial orders framework assumes a lack of precision because we observe latent race in society through individuals and social groups. That is to say, in a given society, we may imagine, right, that racial groups exist. Once you have that imaginary, you then begin to look for them, right? Since there is no true existence of racial groups, right, then your imagination is necessarily going to be errored. It's necessarily going to be flawed. So I'm not going to spend a bunch of time, you know, arguing with people on how to most accurately categorize people into groups that don't exist. You know, I'm just not going to have that conversation. All right. Second, thank you. Getting good at this, Michelle. Second, in racial orders, the race of any given individual is thought to be knowable. And I might note a considerable amount of effort is then spent trying to identify the quote unquote correct race of an individual. Third, it is believed that all racial groups have certain qualities. That is to say, certain types of stereotypes about a group. So for example, here, at least in the United States, there's a movement to sort of have, it's not a new movement, it's been an ongoing movement now for several decades now, but to have sort of mixed race brought in as a group, as a racial group, right? And there's a lot that I could say about this and why I don't think we should, I'm not sure what sense that makes, but what I will say is that for me, mixed race cannot constitute a racial group because we don't have known qualities or stereotypes that work to inform us about the nature of a person once we find out that they are mixed race. In fact, a lot of the mixed race movement is to do that matrix move on race, right? Is to kind of be like, oh, race doesn't apply to me. I'm outside of it, right? And so therefore, if a person or group sort of says, you know, this is my race, and it may not be on the census or whatever, but this is what I am. If there's no known qualities about that person at the discursive level of the society, then we can't really talk about that as a racial group, is the argument there. So fourth, racial categories are believed to be nominal in nature. That is, there is a fixed set of groups and all observed cases must fit into one of these groups, right? So basically, we generally will hold in our imagination some number of groups. We will generally know the name of those groups, and we will generally think that everyone should belong to one of these groups. Generally, that's like the intuition in racialized orders. I'm sorry, next, thank you. And then there's a set of normalizing explanations for racial group rank ordering. And this can come in various forms. I'll leave that there. And then lastly, thank you, lastly, the nature, the ordering of racial orders is not random, right? And so in the United States, the ordering flows from white supremacy on down, so to speak. So I just want to say this is all applied to the U.S. context, right? But one of the things that is important as we think about our models is which conception of the racial order do we think is operant in our society? Okay, so in the United States, the census will give you the list of known racial groups, right? They'll say, okay, there are whites, there are Asians, there are Latinos or Hispanics, et cetera, and so forth, right? However, it could also be that American society is really, that race is really turning on a black-white paradigm. That is to say that racial conflicts and racial dynamics really exist as a form of tension between blacks and whites, and everyone else is sort of collateral damage in that issue. However, other people have also argued that the United States is best considered a white, non-white society, right? And then still others will say black, non-black, right? That is to say, what really matters in America is whether you're white or not. Or to say what really matters in America is whether you are black or not. Or other types of schemes for the racial order of the United States. Eduardo Bonilla Silva has a Latin Americanization thesis, right? Where, and I think we'll talk about this more in the workshop, but he basically argues that there are basically three different racial categories in the United States, right? There are white people, to include groups of people that we don't generally think of as belonging to the white group, right? Like, for example, Cubans, right? Or there are honorary whites, which include people that we don't generally think about that as that, like black immigrants, for example. And then there's a collective black, right? And in the collective black category, there are black people, but there are also Hmong and Lao people, right? People who might otherwise be considered Asian, so to speak, but they are part of the collective black in Eduardo's framework. And then finally, the pigmentocracy or skin color paradigm, which basically just argues that, it's all about a continuum of skin color, if you will, right? In any case, before you begin constructing models, right, my argument is you have to have a sense of what your working theory of the order in your society is, right? The other way of doing it is to go with the representation model, right? Which is frankly gonna lead. I mean, it's just like you just go down this wormhole, right? So for every person, that's basically acknowledging every person and who they say they are and what mix of compositions and then you've got how do you get representative numbers of all these different groups? How do you fit them in your model? It's kind of crazy, right? In the United States, most people will just go with the census groups, right? If they're going to do some kind of thing, right? I would argue that one should have a more developed understanding of the nature of their racial order. All right, so now we get a little bit to the actual kind of statistics. Now, if I haven't said this before, I'll say it now. So two things. Generally, my orientation of teaching these topics is to fill a gap between people who are really quite conversant in statistics, but don't know anything about race, and people who know a lot about race, but don't know much about statistics, okay? And so because of that, I'm not gonna do a deep dive into math and derivations and all that stuff, but there will be a couple of formulas, and I'll try to break them down as much as I can, all right? And yes, thank you. Next slide. Okay, so a critique of disparities research. So most of the existing methods for assessing disparities are based upon calculations between two groups. Well, that's fine if your theory of the racial order is that there are two groups, i.e. maybe black, non-black, or white, black, or I don't know, Chicano, non-Chicano, I don't know, right? But if you believe that there are more than two groups, then conceptualizing disparities becomes a little tricky, right? Because how do you think about a singular assessment of the level of disparity when you have three groups and your only ways of assessing disparities are two group dominant? All right, I'm sorry, thank you. Several of the above conceptions of the US racial order have more than two groups. Next. Therefore, most methods obscure our understanding of disparities in racial orders. The majority of estimates imply a white, non-white racial order. That is, white is the reference group. And finally, this would be okay, except that this operationalization of disparities is usually not in line with the author's statements regarding the racial order. So the first thing to acknowledge here, I'm sorry. So using the racial orders framework, we would first determine the number and kind of racial groups present in the setting or context. And so we might then calculate the distance between these groups either didactically or target group other using existing methods, or calculate the distance between groups. And then third, if we were seeking some kind of summative measure of disparity, we could take the weighted average of these group comparisons in order to assess racial disparity in society. And given this, if we were trying to model disparity, we will have to reconsider the relative strengths and weaknesses of the dummy variable, interaction, and separate model approaches to statistical modeling. So the next one is the dummy variable model. In this equation, we have Y as our outcome. Y is the thing that we're interested in understanding. In this case, racial differences in Y, okay? So let's say Y is, I don't know, I always go to this, but let's say Y is income, right? A is the intercept. We'll say more about the intercept in a second. X is a vector or a collection of characteristics of individuals. So this could be an individual's marital status, how much education they have, what region of the United States they live in, etc. The beta is a vector or collection of, the technical term here would be like a slope or something like that, but we'll just say that identifies the relationship between marital status and income, right? So that's what the B or the beta is going to be for each of those characteristics. And then in this little drawing up, we're going to take R as a dummy variable for racial group membership, right? So in general, what people do is they have whatever the dominant group, they have them coded as 0 in their software. And then they might have the other groups coded as say 1 or 2, etc. And then when they put the model together, the computer basically compares the value of Y for the group that is coded as 0 to the group that is coded as 1. And then it also compares the group that's coded as 0 to the group that's coded as 2, okay? So for example, let's say we have whites, blacks, and Latinos in our society, and we have these as the groups in our model. Whites would be coded as 0. You'd get a coefficient for blacks, which would tell you the difference in income between blacks and whites. And then you get a coefficient for Latinos, which tells you the difference in income for Latinos and whites, okay? But that model is not gonna tell you the difference between blacks and Latinos. You're gonna have to do something else to do that, okay? And then finding a residual error, which is the part that is generally left unexplained in the model. All right, next slide. So I actually prefer to call the dummy variable model the white supremacist model. And now I'm going to try to tell you why I think that. And you can tell me if you disagree or if you have other reasons why it is. Either way, we'll go with it. All right. So the first is that it assumes that the betas and X's are the same for all of the racial groups when these terms are averages that lean towards the largest group. All right, so what does this mean? For most of certainly in the United States, I am ashamed to say that I have very little knowledge of racial or ethnic dynamics in Canada. But in the United States, white folks are the majority group. What that means in that almost every study that assesses racial group differences, whites are going to be the largest group in your data. What's happening behind the scenes when you press the buttons on your computer is that X is going to be an average level of whatever the thing is in your thing. So let's say education in this example. Well, if whites constitute 70% of your sample, then the average that you develop on X is going to be biased towards the white average, okay? So you are then putting together a model where you're assuming the beta, right, the relationship between education and income, that average X is informing that relationship, right? And that average X is biased towards the white average, right? And then you're assigning that biased average to all of the other racial groups in your model, okay? So this problem is then further compounded when we use sampling weights. Now, in the workshop, I'm going to talk in more detail about sampling frames and stratification, but let's try to do this in a sort of quick and dirty way. All right. So a sampling frame is a listing of all of the people in the population that you want to study, right? From that list, you draw a sample from that list, okay? Now, sampling frames are developed using all different kinds of techniques, but in the United States, this is defined by quote unquote population centers, okay? So what this means is there are certain areas of the United States that have to be in your sample in order for you to say that your sample is nationally representative, okay? Given that whites are the majority, they determine where these population centers, quote unquote, are, right? So what this means is that, well, it doesn't mean that, sorry. What ends up happening then is there are areas that have to be included, and then there are areas that are considered replaceable. So for example, Kansas and Tennessee, you could pick either one of those in your sample and you'll be fine, right? Sort of the quote unquote kinds of people that you would find in these two places are more or less interchangeable. And so you can sample from each one of them in an interchangeable way. What's important here is that the distribution of white people in the United States is different from the distribution of non-white people in the United States, right? So at least for Black people, Georgia turns out to be a non-replaceable state, okay? But it is a replaceable state on other so-called nationally representative sampling frames, okay? So technically what that means is that if you are studying Black people and you say you have a national sample, but your sample did not pick anybody from Georgia, then in fact you don't have a nationally representative sample, okay? All right. More importantly, what this means is that since our sampling frames are developed to target areas of white dominance, we then oversample non-white people that are in those areas. The question is whether or not those people, those non-white people, are like their other non-white peers that don't live in proximity to white people. What we do when we then use the weights is we then turn up the value on these less than representative voices of the non-white population, okay? So that's what I'm saying, is that the model is made worse by using sampling weights if the selection process, if the sampling frame is biased towards whites. Does that make sense? So next is the intercept, right? The intercept alpha biases the model in favor of whites, the default omitted group in R. Okay, so basically here's what you're, so again, I don't know who I'm talking to. I don't know how much information, how much people use statistics, know about the thing or anything. So I'm just gonna try to do this in a colloquial way. So when we assign, again, I'm working from the United States context, when we assign white folks the 0, okay, and we produce our model, we will see a coefficient for Blacks and Latinos. We will not see a coefficient for white people. Why is that? Because in a dummy variable, the 0 gets folded into the intercept, okay? So then whites are defining the intercept. As it turns out, the rest of the model is built on the intercept, okay? So you are biasing the entire model towards whites when it is that whites are coded as 0, the default omitted group, etc. Right? So this is the white starting point, baseline, and norm. And what's important to note is that we're then assigning that intercept. That intercept is influencing our values for non-white people, okay? Okay, so this assumes the same model terms also mean the same thing for different groups. So if you have a singular model, okay, and you want to assess as part of this assessment of income, you want to assess not only how big the disparity is between, let's say, whites and Latinos in our little fictive example here. You also want to assess the role of discrimination in producing that disparity, okay? If you have a single model, that means that you're asking white people, right? Have you experienced racial discrimination in this way, the other, right? And then that value of discrimination, and you're gonna also ask Black people and Latino people, then you're gonna get a coefficient for discrimination, a singular coefficient for discrimination in your model, okay? That coefficient is gonna be biased towards the white coefficient. And the qualitative meaning of what white folks are talking about when they say they have been discriminated against racially is totally qualitatively different than what Blacks and Latinos mean when they say this, right? So I have a graduate student at UNC right now who's really interested in this and has been doing, qualitative interviews with white folks about what do they mean when they talk about discrimination. And what they sort of generally are talking about is the prospect of things like affirmative action, okay? That is a really different thing than actually experiencing discrimination, right? So, but if we're working with a singular white supremacist model or dummy variable model, right? We actually cannot discern the relationship between discrimination and income disparities, right? Because either A, we don't ask white people the discrimination questions, which means that white people fall out of the model due to list-wise deletion, right? Or we include white people in the model, give them a discrimination thing, but it's not clearly interpretable as to what's the deal is, right? So these models don't allow for different groups to have different processes relative to the outcome, right? It assumes that all groups have the same factors that lead to income or earnings disparities, right? So all of the betas and X's are shaped or influenced by the racial order, resulting in what you might call racial endogeneity, okay? So what is endogeneity? That's a whole nother conversation, but let me try to do this in the simplest terms possible. So I'm not going to be able to do a sort of pointy thing for the folks there. I think folks in the room, oh, my cursor, oh, there. If you have, in regression, if you have an omitted variable, right, something that is not in your model, but that shapes the variables on the right and left-hand side of your model, right, your inputs and your output, right, and you don't include that variable in your model, right, but again, it's affecting all of your betas and affecting all of your Y and your Y, then your model is considered to be endogenous. In other words, it's incorrectly specified. So as I said before, for income, we might imagine several different kinds of inputs, right? We might imagine education, people with more education make more money. We might imagine, let's go with something like marital status is a decent one, but not highly illustrative for this account. Let's just stick with education. We'll keep it simple. What this model does not account for is racial discrimination in the educational process, okay? So what it is assuming is that education is something that is independent of race, okay? And so we're only viewing the portion of the disparity in this model that remains after taking other things that we believe to be non-racialized things and controlling for those things. The only thing that we're imagining is racialized in this model is group membership, right? But of course, if you look at any field, any subdiscipline, you will find racial inequality, racial discrimination in every sector of our society, whether it's healthcare, criminal justice, etc. So our model, this dummy variable model, basically assumes that that is not true, okay? And that is what you call model misspecification, right? It hides or obscures our ability to assess white supremacy because at a minimum, it doesn't account for the racialized nature of all the other covariates, right? And so we end up with what you might call racial endogeneity. All right, and since all the beta and X's are biased towards whites and set as a constant across all groups, we observe race coefficients as a disparity that remains after non-whites get white returns. So here's what's important to understand here. In a racialized society, there is no norm. There is no norm. Whites are advantaged, non-whites are disadvantaged, right? So nobody's actually at the norm, okay? So then when you assign values for whites to non-whites, you're actually assigning them a certain kind of white privilege, which when you really think about it, is a little bit obscene, right? But this is what we do. All right. I'm sorry, Michelle, we should be down on the third, thank you. And then I think there might be one more. Yes, there is one more. So then this is often, right? This model then is often interpreted using the racial common sense of the context, period, or the ideology of the time, which are often imbued with white supremacist assumptions. So what do I mean by that? So one of the biggest critiques of regression modeling is that everything is inferred from what we call residuals, or what is left over as the unexplained difference in our dummy variable between the racial groups, right? So for example, let's just keep it sort of clean here. So we'll have whites as an omitted zeroed dummy group, and then blacks as the group that has one, right? And so let's say we observe, and our outcome is income. And let's say that we observe in this simple, what we would call a bivariate regression model, we observe that Blacks have $5,000 less income. I'm just making this up, right? And then we enter in education. And what we believe to be happening here is that by entering in education, there should be, we're only now comparing the incomes of Blacks and whites that have the same level of education, right? And so we would then believe that some economists would argue that income difference should go to zero, right? Because there is no discrimination. And the only reason why there's income differences is because Blacks don't have as much education as whites. So once you compare Blacks and whites with the same levels of education, they should also have the same levels of income. In any case, so most of quantitative social science relies on this logic, and we'll talk about it more in the workshop part, which is the mediation logic. And so by entering in education in the model, the disparity in income might be reduced from, say, $5,000 a year to, say, $2,000 a year. And that last $2,000 that's remaining, what people do is they attribute that, they call that discrimination, right? And there's a lot of reasons why that's problematic. By definition, what that is a residual. It is something that is left unexplained. So when we try to articulate what that is, all we're generally doing is putting our ideology right there on the paper, right? So if people are not well educated in what race is, how it operates, then they're likely to infer from that remaining residual that it's not discrimination and that it's actually some unobserved differences between Blacks and whites, i.e. Blacks may have a PhD, but not all PhDs are the same. You know what I mean? It's that kind of logic. And then you're stuck, right? You're stuck. Somebody believes residual is one thing, you believe residual is another thing, and you're just, science has stasis. There's a stasis, right? So I'm sure for folks who have, used statistics and stuff, right? You're like, yeah, Mosi, you're making this whole deal. What about interaction terms, right? Yes. What about interaction terms is probably one of the first things that I'm told or asked about. Hold on, I just want to make sure I'm all up on my cues here. And this is what I'm going to tell you. That results in a white supremacist model with interaction terms. And now I'm going to try to defend it, and you can tell me if you believe it or not. All right. So this is essentially the same model as we just had, except it has interactions in it. So for the audience here, do I have a thing? So here, right, the Y is the same Y. I don't know why I suddenly started using subscript I, sorry. In any case, the Y is the same Y. The A is the same alpha, right? Here now we have a beta 1 and a beta 2. And so these two betas would be different things that we think shape income. And then we have an R, which is our dummy variable for race. And then we would have a beta 3, which in this example might be an interaction or a multiplication between our beta 2 and R. Okay, what is this doing? For people who just don't use math or whatever, this is basically saying that, let's say that beta 2 is education. If beta 2 is education, what we're saying is that different racial groups get a different return to their education, right? So it's saying that, yeah, two people might have 2 PhDs, but we want to account for the fact that, Black folks with a PhD make less money than white folks with a PhD. This is how you would account for that, right? So here, okay, all I want to say first is the Intercept continues to be biased towards whites, assuming that all groups have the same starting point, right? So if you still have whites as your omitted group on R, right, then that 0 is still going to be in the Intercept, and you've still jacked up your model. Second, interaction terms only assess the distance between 2 groups, okay? So if you have an interaction term that assesses, in this case, if that R is 0, 1, white, black, then we're fine in the sense that we'll have an interaction term, we'll have a different coefficient on the relationship between education and income for blacks and whites, right? But also if that R is say 4 different groups, then every interaction term is only going to assess the difference between whites and that group. It's not going to give us a more global sense of inequality. And it still restricts our ability to model things like racial discrimination or the processes that we think are driving inequality, right? Since everybody's still in the same model, it's very difficult to think about ways of measuring, things like racial discrimination. And in general, if you're going to have a debate as to what is causing racial inequality on a given outcome, just good practices is going to want you to have some assessment of blocked opportunity as a potential contributor to that disparity. And if you can't do that in the model, then you've got a white supremacist model because your model doesn't allow you to assess discrimination. You see the point I'm making? And then again, which logic is being used to determine which interactions are used? So maybe you've got an elaborate theory about why education should be interacted with. There should be an interaction term for race and education in your model, right? That's great. But if you have 7 other indicators or coefficients or constructs or inputs in your model, how do you determine which one of those should be interacted with? Well, what's interesting to me, this is when it gets crazy. Some of my colleagues will just say, just do a fully interacted model. To me, that breaks the rules, right? The rules of regression are parsimony. Have as few things as possible. A fully interacted model is by definition not parsimonious, right? So then you're going to be thinking about which ones to interact, and all of them are jacked, right? Given the assumption that that racial orders influence all of these different life domains, right? All right. And so large numbers of interaction terms reduce parsimony. All right. So like I said before, I'm not going to make an argument for any kind of new math, but I'm just trying to make an argument that has generally not been made for why we should use, at a minimum, separate models as part when we do this kind of work. All right. And so I'm going to say a little bit about that. So here are my separate models. The 1, 2, and 3 are subscripts for racialized group 1, 2, and 3. Okay. You can imagine whatever they are. All right. So since all terms are influenced by the racial order, each group is allowed the potential for its own model terms, including their own model intercepts. Secondly, not only might the same terms matter differently, right? That's your interaction term, but different groups can be allowed different factors, okay? And this is where people start getting crazy. So if you have a couple of different models, right? Let's say you have a white model, a black model, and a Latino model in the United States, your white model will not have a term for discrimination, okay? Let's say your black and Latino models do, okay? What then becomes a matter of debate is whether or not the other terms in the model, like education, right, is comparable across the 3 models, because 2 of the 3 models have different sets of coefficients than one of the models, right? So under the strict rules of regression, these models are not comparable. I beg to differ. I would say first, the role of racial discrimination for whites is 0, right? So it zeroes out. And so then secondly, because racial discrimination is a process involved in labor market outcomes for blacks and Latinos, you have racial discrimination in there. So it's fine. You can still compare the coefficients across these separate models, which allows you to have different processes for different groups, which is important because in racialized orders, different groups have different processes on the same outcomes. I hope that's not too jargony to say, but in any case. All right, so this is continuing on. So disparities in the outcomes can be calculated for any set of comparisons, right? So between two specific groups or a target group other, using predictive models for Y. So for example, you could either compare the relationship between education and income in one model to a relationship between education and income to another model. You can also do predicted probabilities, right? Whereby, you could set the level of education that is average for Black people to white people in their predictive model, right? Now you're not being fuzzied by giving Black people the average level of education, which is biased towards the average of education for whites. You can assign either the white average to white people, the Black average to Black people, the Latino average to Latino people, or you can assign the average for Black people to everybody, or however you feel like doing it, and then do predicted probabilities on the outcome to assess disparities in the outcome, okay? Differences in model parameters can be easily calculated for any set of comparisons. So this could be, right, the model Intercept, not the coefficients and means, of course, but also the residual error and the model fit. So for example, if we have a model for income that has just has standard 5 inputs, there's only 5 things that determine income distribution in a given society or whatever, and everybody's doing that, right? Everybody's using those 5 features, those 5 characteristics. Well, in the separate model thing, what we might discover is that model fits really well for white folks, but doesn't fit the same way for other racialized groups. So for example, there might just be less of the dependent variable explained by the standard set of 5 inputs for non-white groups, right? Meaning that we need to still discover more of what is explaining the outcome for these non-white groups, right? And differences in the distribution of the outcome can be fitted using differential link functions, although bootstrapping is always a good option, especially for small samples. So the idea here is that if the distribution on the outcome is different for different groups, you can use a different link function. So this is conversation for people who have a little bit more statistical background, but you can use a different link function to derive your estimate. So for one group, it might be OLS, another group, it might be maximum likelihood, et cetera. One of the critiques of this perspective is that in most samples, you're gonna end up with very small numbers of non-white people. And the way that people usually get away with that is they fold the non-white people into the white people, and then they do they have a sampling weight in there that accounts for the differential sample size of the smaller non-white groups. But then because everybody is in the same model, you're able to come up with estimates because the number of people, the total number of people in your model is a composition of both the white people and the other people. So you're able to come up with estimates. When you break up the model, you might end up discovering or whatever that your sample has, I don't know, 700 white people and like 100 Black people. And maybe you've got like 7, coefficients. The more variables you start to have in that model, you start to be restricted in your ability to develop estimates in that model because you have a very small sample size, right? This is particularly problematic for OLS estimation, but bootstrapping, or what people call Bayesian analysis, is much more efficient at smaller sample sizes, right? So these are ways to account for the different sizes of the samples, etc. All right, so I'm going to stop there for today, and you folks can let me know what you think. Yes.
So, by the way, I love your presentation. I thought it was amazing. I really agree with everything up until the separate models.
Okay.
I just personally think statistically separate models, they're not comparable. I mean, I feel like I could make a better argument for, weighted outcomes, interaction terms, because at the end of the day, if I have a separate model, like a good statistician would look at every model that they make and know it's flawed. There is no model is the word of God, and no one should ever say that anything is. But I think any statistician should be able to say, hey, at the end of the day, my model, maybe it has interaction terms, maybe it's weighted, whatever, it's still flawed. There's still elements of white supremacy within my model, and you talk about that in the discussion section of whatever outcome they were coming up with and saying, it's kind of biased, but it's not, pardon my language, it's not completely bullshit. There might be something in the model that it's still describing. So the thing with the separate models is just how can I talk about the interactions between white people, black people, Latinos, etc., if it's in separate models? That's just where I don't understand.
So I'd like to hear more about where your reasoning comes from that separate models cannot be used to derive meaningful estimates. And the reason why I ask is because there's a whole suite of statistical tests that have been developed precisely to assess differences across models. The assumption for those tests is that you can compare coefficients across models as long as the models are otherwise the same.
But you're saying that.
Now, I'm saying that you can also do separate models with differences, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that if there are different processes involved for different groups, what sense does it make to include a coefficient for a group that I don't have a theory for why that variable or construct or process is important for that group's outcome? Almost every statistician will tell you non-statistically significant coefficients that are in models do not come for free, right? So they move things around in your model. They mess with your degrees of freedom, et cetera, and so forth. So it's actually the only reason why you should have non-statistically significant coefficients in your model is if you have a reason to believe that they would be significant a priori, but it turns out to be non-significant post hoc, right? So you leave it in there because you were testing that thing, right? But given just in a crude sense, I'm sure there are people who have different views as to what produces racial disparities between groups, right? The more conservative among us are going to say the reason why there are disparities is because there are group differences, right? The more liberal among us is going to say the reason why there are disparities is not because there are group differences on the characteristics that matter for the outcome. It's because there are differential returns to the same characteristics, right? And so, so some portion of our assessment of disparities should include both the characteristics that we think are the relevant inputs, like education on income, but also things that might speak to blocked opportunity for income, right? So that at a minimum might be something like interpersonal discrimination at work, right? Now, there are ways to kind of think about this, but in general, there aren't many working theories that suggest that part of what determines whites' income is people discriminating against them because they're white, right? Now, it might be some kind of social network hoarding, opportunity hoarding, perceived positive bias. Those are things that we might put into a white model, but that would be inappropriate to put in a black model. And if we put them all together in the same model, right, these kind of discrimination features or whatever, the actual terms, we've jumbled up a qualitative distinction between terms. So the first thing I would say is that it's one thing to say, I don't believe that we should do separate models. It's another thing to defend it mathematically. And And I just haven't. Now, if the separate models are also different models, I can see why we might have a difference of opinion. But you have to appreciate that the only reason why you believe that thing to be true is because of certain assumptions that were written down vis-a-vis words on paper, right? Numbers on paper that were belief systems developed by human beings. It's just because someone said you can't, right? So given who those people were that say you can't, I disagree with them. I disagree with that perspective, yeah.
Absolutely, but it's also, you're also a human being.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm just a human being that believes that if you want to understand disparities, some part of that disparity, you have to at least entertain that some of it is due to discrimination or blocked opportunity.
I absolutely agree with you qualitatively. To me, it also doesn't make sense to put a discrimination factor in a white model. But if I'm having a survey and I'm asking white people, are you experiencing discrimination? You're going to get some people who are like, oh yeah, I am, and the reason was is affirmative action. That might be something interesting worth studying for me to say, okay, why is it that there's this perception of white people feeling like they're being discriminated against because of affirmative action? Doesn't necessarily mean that I'm omitting like Black experiences or Latino experiences. It just means
So hold on one second. This is what that means in a quantitative study. That means that your measure of discrimination is, dear respondent, have you lost opportunities because of affirmative action? That means you're asking that question to white people, Black people, and Latinos. I don't know that's a question. Most Black people will look at that question and be like, what the fuck is that? You know what I mean? So it's not clear. And we'll talk more in the workshop about interviews and questions, right? Another thing that, because I think I overheard you say that you're not going to be able to make it to the workshop. So I'll just sort of offer you this. So study after study after study shows that Black male Americans report more discrimination than Black women Americans, right? And this is because it's all over every study. People just sort of say Black males experience more discrimination than Black women. Now, to me, there are theories as to why that is the case, why that would be the case. I'm not going to rehearse those theories, but to me, it didn't quite make sense, right? It also happened to be true that I happen to know how these measures of discrimination that are broadly used across social surveys in the United States, like I know the context of how those measures were developed. I happen to know there was like 5 Black men sitting around a table coming up with questions, okay? So I surmised that maybe these questions are tapping into the kinds of discrimination that Black men experience, more so than the kinds of discrimination that Black women experience. So then we went into this crazy world of structural equation models and multiple group confirmatory factor analysis with latent factor means and blah, 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 all this fancy shit, okay? Basically what we show is that yes, the items work differently for Black men and Black women, and that yes, after accounting for that difference, the mean difference in discrimination goes near to 0, okay? And then we surmise at the end of the paper, okay, if we can fix this stuff post hoc with fancy math, if we also put in a question or two that was uniquely tailored to Black women, then we would probably end up with either straight average or maybe Black women experiencing more. In any case, all of this is predicated on a separate model understanding. Multiple group confirmatory factor analysis is a fancy word for separate models. You cannot assess how items, et cetera, are working differently for different groups when they're all in the same model.
Yeah, I see the argument there. I think I just have to read up a little bit more on the separate model to understand it a bit more, because I don't have the training to understand it.
I mean, one of the things that I also will say about separate models, it's really fascinating to me. Whenever I make this argument, I always get pushback on using, from at least one person, if not more, on using separate models to study racialized outcomes. But I never hear anything when I say we should use separate models for men and women. In fact, you can't publish papers in journals, certainly because I do labor market research, you can't publish a paper if it doesn't separate the models by gender, right? But I say separate the models by race, and people start saying, wait, can that happen? I don't know. The rules say, you know, and I'm just inviting people, to step into a crazy world, right? Whereby the initial terms of engagement that were set with particular interests, we revise those terms, right? And the only thing that I keep coming back to on having different models for different groups in particular is people say you can't do that. But I have yet to see a derivation. I have yet to see any kind of proof, right? And all of those people simultaneously will say it's bad practice to put terms in models that you think are unrelated to the outcome. So there's something is happening here, and I'm not exactly sure what it is. Yeah.
Mosi, there's a question from, there's Akeisha Lewis has a question. If you want to unmute yourself and just ask it, you can.
Hi, it's not a, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I think so. I'm turning it up.
I guess it's not really a question so much as I want to clarify as a non-stats math person, if I'm getting the concept behind the whole discussion. What you're saying is, for instance, that say we want to look at income disparity among racialized different groups. Rather than putting all this into one model, you would actually you would look at white people as a separate group, Black people as a group, Latinos as a group, and then you're going to put into your interceptor or whichever one of the things you're saying, things that you think are pertinent to their outcomes. So for white people, for instance, you wouldn't use something related to discrimination because we recognize, structurally speaking, although you may have individuals that experience discrimination, structurally speaking, there isn't the racist impact on white people is not there. But for Black people and Latino people, you would include that. So it's kind of like, I guess, almost like an intersectional look, but with stats, where the things that are pertinent to what creates the outcome is what you're putting into each model. And then because the model is looking specifically at income disparity, those numbers that are produced by the individual models they are comparative because now they've taken into account the micro level things that impact or that have an effect, yes?
Yeah, so I think we're playing in the same sandbox.
Okay, I want to make sure
we're on the same page, you know, if not the same paragraph, right? So the idea here is that in a racialized society, people experience life differently.
Yes.
There are some people that may experience aspect of life A and B, given their racialized position, and there are other people that may not experience A and B, right? So, yeah, so what I'm saying is let's develop an understanding of the processes involved in group level experience by making sure that our models reflect common understandings of the experiences of these groups. When we have a singular model, more or less by definition, we can't do that, right? In addition, unless you have a fully interacted model, all of the other things that I critique the dummy variable model for stand, right? So you basically do a presentation, right? And you say, okay, I got this whole presentation, and we have discovered that these 10 covariates after you control for them, and each of these covariates, by the way, are totally not racialized, totally no racial inequality there. totally no differences in experience. We're just controlling for these totally non-racial factors, right? And we have this level of disparity left over. You've basically hidden all of the white supremacy in all the other factors because you can't even speak to it in your model, right? Yeah, so I'll just sort of say that what's most important to understand is that we know that in racialized societies, different groups of folks have different life chances. They also have different factors affecting their life chances, right? So, for example, let me give you an example of what I'm trying to say by this education thing. So, okay, we got a simple model, right? Income, education. And we say, okay, level of education predicts income, blah, blah, blah. So we want to control for that. So we have blacks and whites. We control for education. Okay. Now, the average black person's education is going to be lower than the average white person's education. We don't say anything about that in a single model. There's nothing about that, right? We don't understand in that model that maybe the black people have less education because they were experiencing racism, right? Because their teachers told them not to take the advanced class and take the remedial class or whatever, And of course, we can talk to education scholars who do nothing but identify racial discrimination in education for a living, right? But that single model ignores all of that, is part of what I'm saying. Now, the separate model can do a better job, but doesn't necessarily get all of the rich nuances of discrimination. It just shows that for black people, it's not the coefficient for black people is not being biased by coefficients for other people at all. So it's a truer assessment, even though in that same model, you're not fully able to assess all of the discrimination that black people might have experienced in education. You're still, it's a whole nother topic, but there's a recent paper by Gatz, Bowen. Hold on, I'm gonna reel it out. Just to show you just how difficult this can be. If you really want to get at the, so even in the separate models, what you're not going to be able to assess is, say, for example, the relationship between how racial segregation determines quality of education, which then determines income. So even in the dummy variable model, single or separate models, whatever, single dummy variable or separate racialized models, you're still not getting at the effects across the dimensions, if that makes sense. There's a great paper conceptually that writes about this. Barbara Reskin, 2012, I think she titles the paper, "The Race Discrimination System." And she has a great, it's basically the same argument that Eduardo Bonilla Silva has in his 1997 Racialized Social Systems paper, but it's less abstract in the ethereal world, and it's more concrete in terms of how she's articulating what this means. So in a very recent paper, 2022, people are trying to develop a way when you have longitudinal data to be able to model the knock-on effects of inequality in each of these domains before you get to the outcome. So what am I saying in all of this? I just want to, because now I feel like I'm rambling. First thing is, yes, we're speaking the same language. We're in the same sandbox. If we believe that in a racialized society, different things matter differently for different groups, then there are two ways to deal with it: a single model with interactions or separate models. What I'm trying to argue is that separate models makes the most sense. The only reason why they don't make as much sense is because people say that you can't have different models with different terms and have whatever shared terms exist between the models, like every model might have an education, and not be able, they say that you can't compare those terms, right? And I disagree, is what I'm saying. And I'm saying that I haven't seen any kind of defense other than dogma as to why those models aren't comparable or not comparable.
I think that's a really great summary of your main takeaway point. It looks like some of the online participants have had to leave. I don't know what's happening in person, but now might be a good time to thank you for these provocative and interesting thoughts. I hope you have a great workshop and the rest of the day and a safe travels home. And so thanks everyone for joining us either virtually or in person. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but maybe it worked out because I got to help out virtually. And please enjoy the rest of your visit to McMaster. And thanks everyone for coming. And be sure to check out our website for future events and talks. And thank you so much, Mosi, for coming to Canada and joining us. And I hope the rest of your day goes well. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. Thank you.